Hi. So today I'm just going to talk about an example of disclosure to show how normative questions underlie the empirical disclosure issues. This is starting with the FDA under the George W. Bush administration, which said that a disclosure on foods saying that they were not bioengineered could be misleading. The reasoning is that because there's no difference, scientifically speaking, between GMO foods and foods produced by traditional plant breeding, this could falsely imply differences in health or nutrition. The FDA is probably right about the implications most consumers take from claims of this sort, but it also threatens producers that want to distinguish themselves as using only traditionally produced ingredients. So this was understood as basically a gift to big bioengineering agriculture. This regime was ultimately replaced, sort of, by a new law in full effect January 1st, 2022. This provides that producers of food that are large enough must disclose the presence of bioengineered ingredients, but not necessarily on the package. You can use a link to say more food information. And I want to make four observations about this version of disclosure. First, two of these four options are in direct contradiction of FTC guidelines for effective disclosure. In fact, it's designed to be ineffective for anyone who doesn't already know what it means if the producer chooses those options. Second, the Secretary of Agriculture is supposed to study whether this scheme provides access to information to consumers, but is not supposed to study whether consumers take advantage of this access. The law has been deliberately framed to avoid changing the consumer information environment and to avoid discovering whether consumers know the information. Third, that doesn't necessarily make this a bad compromise. It just means it can't be defended as improving consumer information in the ordinary sense. Fourth, given all the ways in which producers can obscure the disclosure, the First Amendment analysis might be different here than if it was a straight up bioengineered food required disclosure. The current scheme imposes less of a burden than that because of the options of doing it differently, but also therefore has less of a justification. And this gets to the underlying concern that is increasingly cashed out in First Amendment challenges, but is a policy question all of its own. Disclosures can be used to implement controversial social policy, whether that's pro-bioengineering, like the initial FDA approach, or anti-bioengineering, as in potential state approaches to require disclosure of bioengineering. The real purpose, in fact, of the new federal law was to preempt more explicit state labeling requirements from states like Vermont that would be imposed either by legislatures or by juries in consumer protection cases. This is rent seeking by industries using GMO ingredients, which is why the disclosure is formulated that way. So if you recall our discussion of materiality, usually consumers are entitled to care about whatever they care about, no matter how dumb those preferences are. For GMOs, though, regulators' position is that many consumers are incapable of comprehending the complex set of trade-offs posed by biotechnology, and in particular, they may wrongly think that GMO foods are unsafe when they're not. The question becomes more difficult if you take the position that consumers' preferences can be citizen preferences that are not instrumental. For example, one might want not to buy shoes made with child labor. Likewise, one might not want to eat tomatoes whose genes have been altered in the lab. It may be relevant, too, that the question of whether your individual choice makes a difference turns out to be more complicated than no, of course not. Choices have network effects. It turns out, for example, that if you vote, it increases the likelihood that your close friends will vote, and even the likelihood that their friends will vote. So even if one person can't make a difference alone, a single consumer choice, especially if communicated in some obvious way to others, which is now quite simple for most of us online, that can lead to what's called flocking. So non-instrumental preferences may indeed have instrumental effects. You should also consider, however, the criticism from the other side, which is that disclosures don't work. So especially for constitutional analysis, if we put into our doctrine that disclosures are the favorite option versus prohibition, and also are the favorite option when the legislature wants to impose them, we may end up approving a lot of deceptive speech and not achieving the goals that justified the mandatory disclosure in the first place. When our goal isn't to avoid deception with our disclosure, but just to change the information environment, the consequence may be less demoralizing, but it still means that mandatory information disclosures are unlikely to be as nudge-y to consumers and affect their behavior as we want them to be. So that's some background, and I will see you in class. Thanks.